There is a wound so old most empaths have stopped recognizing it as a wound. It has been there so long it feels like personality, like character, like simply the way they are wired and have always been wired. It expresses itself in how quickly they apologize, in how much space they take up, or rather, how carefully they avoid taking up too much, in the way they read the room before they read themselves, in the way other people's comfort becomes, automatically and without decision, more urgent than their own. They call it being considerate, being selfless, being good. Jung would call it something else. He would call it the first and most fundamental adaptation a child makes, when the environment they depend on for survival communicates, clearly or subtly, that their authentic self is too much, too loud, too needy, too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding of something the adults around them could not give. The wound is not dramatic necessarily. It does not require abuse in the obvious sense. It does not need violence or abandonment or cruelty to take hold. It can form in the quietest households, behind the most respectable facades, in families where love was genuine and still somehow conditional, where the child was adored for being easy and unseen when they were not. This is the wound at the center of the empath's life, and until it is found and properly named and sat with in the way it was never sat with when it first opened, everything built on top of it, every boundary, every insight, every carefully constructed understanding of patterns and healing, rests on ground that can still shift. Jung spent decades studying what he called the persona, the mask the psyche constructs to navigate the social world. In healthy development, the persona is flexible. It adjusts to context without replacing the self underneath it. The person knows the mask is a mask and can put it down in private, in intimacy, in solitude. But in the empath's childhood, something different happened. The persona did not develop as a tool. It developed as a survival mechanism. The child who discovered early that their sadness made the adults around them anxious learned to manage that sadness before expressing it. The child whose anger frightened or destabilized the people they depended on learned to convert anger into something more acceptable: self-blame, silence, the particular brightness that asks nothing and reassures everyone. The child whose needs were consistently met with overwhelm, withdrawal, or irritation learned that needs themselves were dangerous, that the safest version of themselves was the version that did not require anything. And here is the part that makes this wound so difficult to locate later. It worked. The child who became easy, attuned, selfless, that child was often rewarded with approval, with warmth, with the particular love that came when they were not being too much. They learned that being less brought more, that shrinking created safety, that the love available to them was contingent on their ability to manage themselves in ways that protected others from having to manage anything. Jung called the parts of the self that are sacrificed in this process the shadow, not in the sinister sense, but in the literal one, the aspects of the self that could not be expressed and so went underground, did not disappear, went underground. The empath's shadow is full of everything they were not allowed to be, full of anger that was converted before it could speak, full of need that learned to disguise itself as generosity, full of a self that wanted to take up space and was taught, patiently and thoroughly, that this was not what good children did, not what lovable people did, not what kept the peace. This wound has a specific texture in adult life. It appears in the way empaths relate to conflict, not just avoiding it, but experiencing it as existential threat. When a relationship is in tension, something in the empath's body responds as though survival itself is at stake. Because once it was. When the adults who controlled food and shelter and warmth were displeased, the child's world genuinely narrowed. The nervous system encoded that equation and has been running it ever since, regardless of whether the current relationship has anything like that power. It appears in how empaths receive care, in the discomfort that arises when someone offers something without condition, in the suspicion, never quite conscious, that the kindness must want something, that the generosity will become a debt, that being cared for is a temporary state that must be earned continuously, or it will be withdrawn. It appears in the chronic overextension, the inability to say no, not because the empath doesn't know they should, not because they lack the intellectual understanding that their limits matter, but because something deeper than understanding is running. Something that still believes in the wordless way the body believes things, that being useful is the price of being kept. Jung found that this belief, that love is conditional on performance, on smallness, on the management of one's own interior so that others remain comfortable, is the single most corrosive force in the empath's adult life. Not because it is irrational. It was entirely rational once. It was the correct reading of an environment that communicated it clearly. The tragedy is not that the child learned it. The tragedy is that the adult has never been given reason to unlearn it. The healing of this wound does not begin with boundaries. This is what most healing frameworks miss, and why empaths can spend years setting boundaries without ever reaching the place the boundary setting was supposed to lead to. Boundaries are a structure, and structures built over an unexamined foundation will keep reproducing the same cracks. The healing begins earlier than boundaries. It begins with grief, specifically with the grief for the child who had to become something other than themselves in order to be safe, who learned to read other people's emotions before their own because their own were not the priority in the room, who converted their sensitivity into a service rather than being allowed to experience it as simply, ordinarily theirs. Jung believed this grief was the most avoided and most necessary part of the healing process, because to grieve the childhood wound properly requires something the empath has almost never been allowed: to let what happened to them simply be wrong, not complicated, not understandable given the circumstances, not softened by the awareness that the adults involved were also wounded, also doing their best, also carrying more than they could hold. All of that may be true, and it is also true that a child should not have had to become small to be loved. Both of those things can exist simultaneously. And the empath, who has spent a lifetime holding complexity on behalf of others, must learn to hold this particular complexity on behalf of themselves. The wound does not close through understanding the people who created it. It closes through finally siding with the child who sustained it. There is a moment in this process that Jung documented in patient after patient, a moment that arrives without announcement, usually in the middle of something ordinary, when the empath, for the first time, feels something they were never permitted to feel in the original environment: anger. Clean and uncomplicated anger, not at themselves, not converted into sadness or guilt or the anxious need to repair something, but direct, legitimate anger at what was asked of them when they had no language to refuse it. This anger is not a regression. It is not the empath becoming who they feared they'd become if they stopped managing themselves so carefully. It is the shadow returning. The parts of the self that went underground decades ago surfacing now because the environment is finally safe enough for them to come back. Jung called this the beginning of genuine integration, the persona relaxing its grip, the authentic self beginning, tentatively, to move into spaces it was once forbidden to occupy. The empath who reaches this place often describes something they did not expect. Not hardness, but relief. Not the loss of their sensitivity, but a new relationship to it. One in which the feeling is theirs again, chosen rather than compelled, directed rather than reflexive. You were not born to be easy. You were not born to manage the emotional temperature of rooms at the expense of your own. You were not born to locate everyone else's needs before you had finished locating your own. You were not born to make yourself small enough to be kept. You learned all of that. You learned it because you had to, because the environment you depended on required it, because the love available came with conditions the child in you was wise enough to meet. But the child who learned to be small is not the only thing you are. Underneath that learning, underneath the persona, underneath the reflexive selflessness, Underneath the body that still braces for the withdrawal of warmth when you take up too much space, there is a self that was never actually diminished. Only waiting. Jung would tell you the work is not to become someone different. It is to become someone complete, to bring back what went underground and give it the room it was denied, to let the child who became easy finally, at whatever age this finds you, become whole. The wound you have been living around is not who you are. It is what you survived. And surviving it was never supposed to be the end of the story.